Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2024 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the competitive poetry category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's Book Awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the poetry category through the generosity of Wellington Management, Inc. My name is Janna Knittel. My book, Real Work, published by Noden Press, was a Minnesota Book Award finalist in poetry for 2023. As we get started, we would like to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land on which most of us on this panel recording are participating from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we all work together to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Jennifer Manthey, author of The Fight, published by Trio House Press, Claire Wahmanholm, author of Meltwater, published by Milkweed Editions, Chaun Webster, author of Whale Song, or Waiting in the Water at the End of the World, published by Black Ocean, Nell Westerman, author of Songs Blood Deep, published by Holy Cow Press. Congratulations to each of you. To make the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have a question specific to each of you and your wonderful finalist book. So for the round robin question, I would like to learn more about your books by hearing each of you describe how you began your work on them. Were they individual poems later organized into a book, or did you have the larger project in mind when you began writing it? What was the initial spark or idea that inspired your book? As part of this question, I invite each of you to read one poem from your collection. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm going to read the poem from my book. It's called Thanksgiving 2013. So I didn't have like a whole plan for a book. I wrote poems over a number of years, partially while I was in grad school, many of them after I graduated. And this poem I chose to read because when I wrote it, it felt really satisfying to be able to express something, even though I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to say. And when I wrote this poem, I knew I wanted to write more poems like it. And I knew this is something poems do so well, that they don't ask for a thesis statement or a neat conclusion. They're just asking me to carefully observe and give my emotional honesty. So I will read Thanksgiving 2013. Inside the house, 22 white people and one black baby. Turkey in the air, and the conversation turns from food to birds. And then a great uncle has a joke with the punchline, Jim Crow. Jim Crow. And some people laugh with their heads back, and some people are quiet. And a woman picks up her baby, gathers up his blanket and small toys, and says he needs some air. She walks with him and remembers a hot Kinshasa street. Before their goodbye, his first mother raised his tiny arm and waved it, saying, American, American. And the woman returns. They sit and eat. Some lean back in their long line of mismatched chairs, satisfied. And some ache a bit, thinking, maybe we've taken too much. Thanks.
All right, so then that would put Claire second. I'll volunteer you.
Thanks. Yeah, this is actually incredible. Like with my last name, I'm hardly ever second. So like, thank you, Chaun and Gwen. This is it's a lots of W's on this panel. Um, so this book, I think I had thought of Meltwater as a book sort of from the beginning. After my first two books, everything I write now, I sort of picture like it's as a book instead of kind of individual poems. I think in the unit of the book now. And I think for this one, the earliest poems, if I remember, I think I was about 7 months pregnant with my second child. And so I was writing from there through about when she was 1.5. And so the motivating question behind this book is probably why did we choose to have a second child? And to answer that question, you sort of have to include the things that would make you pose that question in the first place. Like if things were awesome and great, you probably wouldn't have to ask, like, oh, why bring more children into the world? So the book is full of some very real bummers, climate catastrophe, species loss, extractive capitalism, war, gun violence, as well as just like the ordinary dangers of being vulnerable in the world. Plus I was writing the earliest, actually no, the last section of the book was during during lockdown, I think, during the early months of the pandemic, which added a totally surreal, disorienting layer to an experience that is already surreal and disorienting, right? Like having a child. So the book includes like those things very much in the foreground, but it also includes my attempt to answer the question genuinely, like why have more children? And we did this because, we did think it was worth it because we do still believe in the world and in human communities and in certain kinds of redemption and in resistance to despair. And so the book kind of swings through some pretty significant extremes in kind of tracking that journey and answering both of those questions sort of as best as I could. And actually, I think I'd like to read one of the very first kind of erasures and Meltwater poems, but since I'm talking about erasures later, I might read it after that question, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Chaun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the question. I think that in terms of whale song and what either prompted or like what was a part of its making, like I don't know necessarily that I always think of the writing as being for a book, like and as I'm writing, I think that for me, like it, at least like in terms of process wise, I think that becomes something that either slows me down or thinks it has me feeling a particular kind of like I have to like build a certain kind of architecture like too early for something. And so I don't always know what I'm trying to do. And I don't always know like what something's for. And so sometimes those things are just questions that I have. In this case, like as far as like some of the questions that were central to this, like I was thinking a lot about I was thinking about death. I was thinking a lot about I was thinking about Blackness, like both in its construction, like, and so thinking about what it required to constitute Blackness as a space, as an ideological position, as as something that we impose on the flesh, and then what then does it mean when like in the West, like if we understand like or believe what folks like Edward Glissant are saying in terms of like the birth of New World Blackness being in the space of the hull of the slave ship, like what then does it mean when that is understood to be like kind of the space of death? Like, and so so then the questions like that animate the book are more around like is death something that is a kind of event that is based in a kind of a teleology of like, you know, we live and then we die, or is it something that is constituting Blackness itself? And so that's kind of like a central question to the book. One that I try to hold in with a kind of agnosticism, like and did not, at least in my asking of the question and my writing of the book, like have a sense of like what I thought as this kind of like answer to that question. And so so yeah, like I think that those are kind of like for me, like the book is animated by questions, like, and it's and I don't know necessarily that those questions are ones that I answered or was like necessarily. I was thinking more so to try to move maybe further into the question than I was to like kind of seek a resolution to it. If that makes a kind of sense. And so I'll read a poem. So there are a series of like pieces within Whale Song that are about Pip, who's a Black character out of Moby Dick, who's a mostly silent character. And as you like, Whale Song like thinks about the position of the human and the non-human animal, and a lot of times we make that distinction based on the human being someone who speaks. And so thinking of Pip as like this mostly non-speaking character within the space of like Moby Dick, was trying to think about their connection also, like that kind of blurs like the line of the human and the non-human animal. This says, Pip jumps the Piquad after hallucinating about the human and subsequently giving up on land. Movie pitch. It begins with a fever dream. Pip haunted by the ground he stands on. Something terrifying about its sureness, its carcerality. No, it begins somewhere in his torn open throat, slit wide by a harpoon, camera panning each angle of Pip's neck as he wails, "Look, a Negro." It begins with nothing, screen black dark as the ocean floor. No, it begins with something, a body, itself both more and less than one, laying on the deck of the Pequod, attempting to float, misjudging the surface for water, mistaking his lack of sinking for buoyancy. No, it begins with the disavowal of land, with Pip tasting that salt water and it doing something like the opposite of stripping him of wings. Pip jumps the Pequod. No, it begins.
Thank you so much. Gwen.
It's great to be here and share this space with all of you today. Oh my gosh, I'm already inspired by what I've heard from each of you. My book, Songs Blood Deep, has kind of a long gestation. In 2006, I was at a poetry workshop in North Dakota, and I began thinking about how to connect, how to bridge my mother's family from Oklahoma to my father's family in Minnesota and South Dakota. They met at Haskell Indian Institute, and so that's how I came to be from such disparate parts of the plains. So I'm part of that bridge because I grew up in Kansas, and I've now lived in Minnesota longer than I lived anywhere in my life. There are two languages, two cultures, two histories that shape who I am. And so it was, how do I bring these two pieces together in one place? So I wrote a few poems about that. And then during the pandemic, which we all seem to have been inspired by, I found Tonka poetry, which is a form older than haiku, but it has a little more space, 5 lines, 31 syllables. And so every day in November that year for Poetry Writing Month, I wrote a tanka. I would write one in English and then translate it into Dakota, or I would write one in Dakota and then translate it into English. And that's where a lot of these poems came from. And others of them are telling the story of the stories that I heard as a child and that I carry. So I organized it by season and began with the fall, Ptanyetu, which is a time of transition, and worked the sections through and end with summer, which is a time of growth. And so that's how I saw my arc as a storyteller in this particular collection. So the piece I'm going to read is called Rising. Morning song rises above frost-covered earth, disperses in the sun. Migratory paths follow rivers, winds, imprinted on land by time. Cell memories carry genetic experience in heart, blood, bone. Strength of the generations, tender as lilacs, returns in spring song.
Wonderful. It's so great to hear each of you talk about and read from your work. Let's go ahead and continue alphabetical order. So Jen, you'll be up first, and I'll refer to the mother in your poems recounting your experiences with adoption, separating the poetic voice from you, the person. As the book progressed, I felt increasingly sympathetic toward her. Did you feel the need to create that progression, or was it something that just happened as you wrote the poems? Related to that, how would you describe the role of the persona poems from Verena Davis's point of view in the book?
Sure, thanks for the question. So first of all, I'll say that you don't have to separate me from the speaker of the poems. I know that's really important in so much of poetry because we're not writing factual accounts of things, but I'm fine if readers assume that I am the mother and myself. And I think for me, I say that because for me, writing about whiteness, it was really important to not separate myself from problematic systems. I feel like if I'm going to examine these kind of difficult things like adoption and race, I should be willing to be personally involved, and I should be willing to talk about how I've participated in these systems and how they have affected and shaped me. So in my book, I'm trying to confront things that are uncomfortable because I think that's how we change and how we improve. As far as the progression in the book, I wrote these poems over quite a number of years. My son was getting older and I hopefully was changing. I was living my life as a mom. I was trying to learn more about how to be a good mom to a Black adopted son. And so, the progression was not intentional, but I think I understand what you're seeing there. And I do feel like a sort of increasing desperation as my son gets older. So I think that comes through in the writing. And this kind of motivates me, right? Because I want a safer place for my son to live. I want white people to be able to look at themselves and contemplate whiteness and how it works and how it affects others, because I want my son to be safe. And I can't really hope for others to do that if I'm not willing to do it myself. And I'm the mother of 2 white children also, and I feel, a different kind of desperation for them to not live in a place that's inequitable, because I think that's degrading to our souls, to sort of participate in systems that might benefit us and hurt others. Yeah, and as far as Brina Davis, I'll say that she gave me a way to examine adoption and its history. So her role in the book was kind of as a reminder that adoption does have historical relationships with white supremacy. And so, yeah, her role was kind of to remind us and show us that adoption is not this pure, flawless process.
Great, thank you so much. Claire, you get to be second again. Erasure poems titled Meltwater appear throughout your book. And you've mentioned them in the round robin question. Your erasures are extensive, and the resulting poems are very sparse, with mostly white space on each page. Could you talk about how these poems came about, what erasure poems mean to you, and or the relationship between these poems and the other poems in the collection?
For sure, for sure. And I would like to start by saying that my relationship with to the method that we often call erasure is deliberately not an antagonistic one. I know that many poets and writers use erasure as a way of undermining or critiquing a source text that deserves, dismantling, undermining, critiquing, etc. But all of the erasures that I've undertaken so far as a writer, the ones in Redmouth and Wilder and in Meltwater, have been working with texts that I really admire, that I love, that I'm compelled by, and that I want to spend more time with. And I've been trying to find a different word than erasure for the way I work with these texts, which I really see more as like a kind of close reading. But I haven't found a non-clunky word for that. If someone wants to give me one, that'd be great. I will take them. And so I just wanted to make clear that that's how I was approaching Lacey M. Johnson's article, How to Mourn a Glacier, which I took all these erasures, or how I did all these kind of close readings. And her article is so beautifully written and poignant. And so the relationship is not an antagonistic one there. So to talk about the erasures, I have to talk about the other sequence of poems that is in Meltwater, which are these kind of chunky prose poems, and they're all called Glacier. And there's like 4 of them in there. And I had written that sequence of poems first. And they were all written fairly quickly. They're all kind of in the same voice and same rhythm. They're all kind of a piece. And they sort of tell this story of, it's supposed to be kind of speculative, supposed to be future oriented, although many of the elements in those poems are actually turning up in real life now in kind of a horrifying way. But it's supposed to take place in this era of like glacial tourism. Maybe there's like 3 or 4 glaciers left in the world, and you can see them in these kind of touristy sort of spots. And it's these people kind of moving through and kind of visiting each glacier and like checking them off the list. And then when I read Lacey M. Johnson's article, I had originally envisioned like doing an erasure of it and that being like maybe the final glacier poem in the sequence. So it would be kind of like an anti-glacier poem. It would show the result of all this kind of capitalist, extractivist tourism that the prose poems explore. And it would show that like that melting, that diminishment that comes from that relationship or treatment of the natural world. So there's just supposed to be one poem originally. But the article is so rich and so complex, and there's just like so many layers. I realized I couldn't just do one poem. I realized it was the start of a different, sequence. I didn't know there would be 8 or 9, that number. I just kept kind of going through the article and sifting out, a layer of poems each time. And I think what I was kind of hoping to show is, the real effects on the page of that diminishment and loss, but also trying to hold out for the idea that, despite a certain percentage of loss of like the original word. So I think like her article was originally, I want to say the longest Meltwater is maybe 95 words. So I think it's like 4% of the original, and the very last Meltwater is only 26 words. So it's 1%, I think, of the original text. Anyway, so trying to show or hold out the idea that even with all this loss, we can still make meaning. We can still kind of make beautiful artifacts. There's still something worth saying. And so it was a way of kind of resisting paralysis and despair. There's always something more you can say. So I'll read, I might actually, because the poems are so short, I'm going to read the very first Meltwater, the longest one, and then the very last Meltwater, which is the very shortest one. And then you can maybe hear kind of the difference in just how long they take to read. So yeah, I mean, Janna, you mentioned they kind of look, I don't know if you can, they kind of look like this, but they are like very spaced out on the page. And I tried to mimic, as you know, I moved the margins as little as possible so that like the words were, as they appear on the page is where if you kind of put the article over the top, they should line up almost like how with the original article. So I tried to have as little of a hand in that as possible. Okay, so here's the first one in the book, and again, they're both called Meltwater. Meltwater. Ice stretches between us and history. Oh, slushy shadow, oh, long gray rain that floods the ice with memory. The water of the future followed us. No arc appeared, no spell of unmaking. Time is a land of lies. We stumble between glaciers and memory and try to explain our path. Oh, uncommonly sunny death that brightened the summer snow. The melting point of ice is empire. Formed by dust, we were baptized in concrete and our own acceleration. It trickled down to the future in gray statistics. Oh, child, the meltwater was so deep. Meltwater. An early morning. Child, you are a memorial at the site of our story. On the black earth, I say we are the most irreversible thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Chaun, you intertwine poetry as text, visual poetry, and graphics in your book. Do you see a clear division between the poems that are poems and the visuals that are visuals, or do the genres always overlap and blur in the book? And, or how would you read or perform some of the poems that use form or graphics in ways that challenge readers' understanding of language?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I suppose I'm a little, I'm always a little bit antagonistic to genre itself. Like I have and I think that poetry itself like offers a unique space to ask certain questions about genre, to ask certain questions about our own sorts of fidelity to genre, to what and how we think about certain kinds of borders around how one might understand a text. And so I think poetry has been a space where I've been able to see the unique ability to ask some of those questions, both in form and content. I think that in terms of thinking about the poems as poems or the poems as visuals, I don't know necessarily that I make those kinds of like delineations. Like and I think that there's also a tradition around a lot of this, right? Like, and it's a fairly, it's not a recent one. There's been a lot of folks that have done a lot of this work. Both folks who formally understand themselves to be writers, but then also folks that are doing work within visual art. So I think about folks like Imnor Besse Philip, I think about Douglas Kearney, I think about Renee Gladman. I think about Carolyn Kent, who's a visual artist, but whose visual work in abstraction also deals with language. And so I think that in terms of like Renee Gladman has this book, Prose Architectures, that I really love. and she talks about how she was doing all of this writing, and so much of the writing that she was doing was on architecture and thinking about space, thinking about buildings. And if you read like the Ravnica series, like you can kind of trace like that interest of hers like in her writing. But Renee Gladman talks about how she didn't want to simply, like in prose architecture, she talks about how she didn't want to simply write architecture anymore. She wanted to think about a way to use its figurative power to move deeper into it. And so I think about that as a kind of method in the way that I move in some of my own work as and even like in terms of like, you know, when there are certain kinds of abstractions, whether that be that a text is superimposed or whether that be that there is something that is more gestural in the way of a drawing. I think that some of those spaces within the place of the text are like I think that we have a certain kind of like hierarchy in the reading in the West also, like in terms of like even how we approach like text. I think that we end up like thinking about text as a space in which we want to do this sense making thing first in the protocols that we have around it. And so we want to look at a text for what it means and extract meaning from a text in every place that we can. And I think that that's a part of maybe what I see as like our highest priority in the West in terms of our reading protocols, like is sense making, which I tend to want to resist in some respects. Like, and then I think that, you know, on lower levels of that hierarchy are like, you know, looking at a text for whether it be like its sonic quality. And then maybe somewhere lower on that pole is like what we think of as its visuality. And there's a way that we tend to think of text itself, which is a graphic unit. Like, you know, these letters are graphic units, you know, and so I think that we tend to like see them as a vehicle to meaning as opposed to like holding or having any form of meaning in them already. And so there are ways that also at moments in which I'm maybe playing with things, like I not only am like looking at how to reach a certain kind of simultaneity that I think can is difficult to reach in a two-dimensional space of the page, but also like is something where like, you know, when thinking about a certain kind of linear approach to like writing is also something that's I find restrictive. But also like I'm trying to think about how to make more obvious that we are having, or to disrupt this sense of like the text itself as being this vehicle alone to the meaning. And so yeah, I think that maybe is a part of like how I'm approaching that work in terms of like the reading of that work. I think that there are ways that I have approached some of the reading of those texts, like both in this and other work of mine, that have been a kind of machine assisted form of reading. And so thinking about ways that I'm just using other kinds of like technologies to like produce the echo of that work. And so, yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Gwen, you are up now. Your book delves into large concepts such as ancestry and belonging, but also natural beauty. There are strong visual images, such as the feathers in the ice and a single tundra swan in a field. How do you see the relationship between these little moments of beauty and the larger issues in your book?
It's about connecting to the world around us, taking the time to notice beauty amidst the chaos of our daily lives. Those little moments of beauty that you mentioned can ground us I believe. And they also can remind us that we can find joy in even the smallest little things, like ice crystals in a small frozen puddle of water on a gravel driveway. That's where I saw feathers in the ice. But we have to stop for just a moment and be still and breathe. If we stop for just a moment to notice what's happening around us in the bigger, broader expanse of our existence. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandmother from the time I was born until I left high school, basically. And she told me a lot of the stories that her grandmother told her. And I grew up with this understanding of how we are connected to the land, how we're connected to each other. And one of the stories that she told me was that, and there's a poem in Songs Blood Deep about this. My grandma told me that her grandma said that her grandma told her that when we came over the top of the world, there were already people here. And I didn't think much about that. I just knew that that was the story and that's the way it was. I didn't question it. But a few years ago, I did my mitochondrial DNA. And my maternal line is haplogroup C, which is the third group that came over the top of the world to this side. And it made me value even more the traditional knowledge that I've been taught. So in a lot of the things that I write, I take into account that we are all connected to each other through story, especially the stories that we carry from those who came before us, from those generations of knowledge keepers that can help us understand this world and who we are. And sometimes I talk to people who don't have those kinds of stories. They are disconnected for whatever reason, loss, anger, separation, and I feel sad that they don't have that trove of knowledge from grandparents and the grandparents before them. But I think there are ways that we can connect that in just sharing what we know. And so that's one of the reasons that this title for this collection is so important, that these are songs that I've carried, and they are literally blood deep. And we carry knowledge as Indigenous people that contemporary science is just now catching up with. The Dakota people, my father's side of the family, are star people. Our stories tell us that we came to this place, Minnesota, from the stars. And I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson on a program one time talking about how we are made of stardust and we came from the stars. And I yelled at him and said, of course, I yelled at the TV and I said, we knew that. we knew that we came from the stars. So there's some funny things in here. There's some serious things in here, but mostly it's about just taking time to listen to those stories, to those songs we carry, that make us who we are and can help us find those connections, especially when we may feel very disconnected from everything around us.
Wonderful. I wish I had much more time to talk to all of you. Maybe I will in the future. For now, thank you. You are tremendous for poetry category finalists. And to everyone watching, thank you for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. And thanks again to Wellington Management Inc. for sponsoring the category. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. Mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 7. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 8 others are finally revealed. Join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are just $22, including processing fees. Visit thefriends.org/MNBA for details. Goodbye for now, and good luck to all of the finalists.